This week, we're going to have a short discussion about peer review and your photos assignment. Keep in mind with peer review, I know you all have experiences with it, but do remember that it is one of those situations where you want to remember that your actions affect others, or in other words, what they call the platinum rule. Provide the kind of work and quality that you would like to see other people provide for you. Another quick reminder for peer review is that you want to focus on larger order concerns rather than smaller concerns. So larger order concerns are things like structural issues, organizational issues, thesis and evidence questions, as opposed to editing and smaller details like that. Of course, you want to pay attention to the smaller details, but your priority at this stage is to provide feedback about what's working overall in the essay. Because of course there's going to be a couple more drafts and people might not have gotten to the details yet. And I'll talk a little bit more about peer review in the next slide. Also in this little lecture is a discussion about your photos assignment that's coming up. And there are a few things to remember here too, and I'll go over those in a minute. Most of us have had up and down experiences with peer review. So let's talk a little bit about what can be good about peer review and what we might want to avoid. First, what it does for you as a reader is that it gives you an eye for what's working in an essay especially well and what you might want to improve on. And you can see what's happening in other people's writing a lot easier than you can see what's happening in your own. We have a lot more objectivity with other people's writing than we do with what we write. We're more attached to our own ideas. We have feelings about the kinds of things we write, and we sort of slave over the words in a way that reading other people's work doesn't seem to bother us. We don't mind if they've slaved. It's much harder to read our own work. As a writer, going through the process of evaluating and looking at what's working in another person's essay helps you really see the kinds of things you might do in your own writing. Do you also have a similar pattern with introductions and conclusions, let's say? Or do you see how the writer incorporates evidence in ways that you could do that might work for you as well? So you see both things that you see in your own writing in other people's work, and you also see maybe what you don't want to do, plus maybe what you do want to do. So you get the benefit of both incorporating what's working and trying to avoid the pitfalls of what's not working. There are lots of good ways to be a peer reviewer. There's also things not to do that we've probably all experienced. The assignment will help you be clear about what kinds of feedback to give, but in particular what we want to avoid is being too general. Hey, great paper, you need a comma here, you're all set, you're getting an A, right? That kind of feedback isn't really specific enough to help us figure out how to revise productively. That's one thing you don't want to do. Another thing you don't want to do is talk about the person or the quality of the writing rather than what the writing's accomplishing, right? So, for example, you wouldn't ever want to start your peer review with something like, well, your introduction is terrible. You might think about, right? Nobody wants to hear something like that. Instead, a really good way to phrase a question about an introduction is to say something like, well, I see that your paper's about chemistry, but what I don't see is a specific thesis. Are you trying to ask about this? ? So it helps to be specific enough to be able to give the writer something to go on to revise. So you want to frame your feedback in terms of questions, right? I didn't understand this. Help me understand that. That's usually a better way to go. Also, it's really helpful to frame your feedback in terms of what you see as a reader as opposed to what things they're doing as a writer. So you can use the language of, as a reader, I understand how your first paragraph connects to your thesis, but I don't understand how your second paragraph connects to the thesis. And that way it isn't about, again, what the person has done wrong, but what the writer's actually doing in the world. And that's super helpful as we start to learn how to use peer review productively. Your photos assignment asks you to take 3 original photos. They have to be original because if they're going to be reproduced on the web or in the magazine, in order to make sure we're not infringing on copyright rules, then the best way to do that is to make sure that they're photos that you have taken or that you have permission to use from someone you know who took them for you. Another thing to think about is that you want them to be the highest quality possible. That works well for printing and for on the web. That way they aren't pixelated and blurry when you make them larger. Be sure to include a picture of yourself. It doesn't have to be with your research or doing your research or anything like that, but if you can work that in, great. But you definitely want to include a picture of yourself. And you probably don't want a glamour shot here. You probably want something a little bit studious because it will be on your poster, and you might or might not be standing in front of it when people come by and look at your work, and you want to present yourself as a polished student researcher. You might have to get creative. So the assignment asks you to have 2 additional photos beyond the one of yourself that illustrates or expands on or makes your research clearer for your reader. So some topics are easier to research than others. For example, if you're researching the quality of the food in the calf, well, that's pretty easy to photograph. If you're researching, like some students have in the past, let's say the effects of solitary confinement on prisoners, that's a lot harder to photograph. So you're going to have to get creative. And students do great with this. You've always done great with this. So imagine perhaps recreating a scene with special effects. I don't mean fancy effects, but maybe with lighting or with makeup that can help illustrate the nature of your work without actually having to be there or have it be the actual research site. So you can take pictures of people that are in staged situations, and adding captions, which of course I'm going to ask you to do, will help your reader understand what those photos mean and how they fit in with your project. Which leads me to the next point. Don't forget to provide captions so that your reader understands your work and they can make sense of why the pictures you have are the ones that you included. Also, if somebody else helped you with your pictures, be sure and give them byline credit, and I'm sure they would appreciate that.